We have a great webinar planned for you today. You may have attended our May webinar where we had an expert speaker on sewage waste. So this is a webinar continuing on expanding on that information. Tracy Carluccio, the Deputy Director at Delaware Riverkeeper Network, will be our speaker for tonight, who will be discussing on the lowdown on PADEP's proposed biosolids and sewage sludge permit revisions and how to give input, and DRN's recommendations for improving the proposed permit changes. Afterwards, we'll have time for a question and answer session. And now I'll turn it over to Tracy.
Good evening. Thank you, everybody, for joining. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you, Jairus. So we're going to look tonight at Pennsylvania DEP's proposed revisions to their general permits that cover the biosolids application on land. There are 3 different permits that DEP has that they're addressing, and there's 4 areas in each of those permits that they're proposing changes to. So we'll look at them one by one. So the PAG 7 is the general permit for exceptional quality biosolids or Class A biosolids to be applied to land. PAG 08 is the permit that's used to apply beneficial use, what they call beneficial use of biosolids Class B. And PAG 09 is the general permit for the application of residential septage to land. There are no changes being proposed by DEP to the actual regulations that govern biosolids. It's only to these 3 general permits. There's a 60-day comment period that's open now. It closes at 11:59 sharp on September 2nd. And you can submit written comment using DEP's e-comment platform or by emailing, and we will be giving a little more detailed information on that at the end of the webinar. The Pennsylvania DEP library has all the documents. They have fact sheets and the proposed biosolids general permit revisions posted at that link there, and Jairus is going to be putting that link into the chat. So biosolids are sewage sludge. And for this webinar, our purposes here, we're going to call them biosolids. I usually call them sewage sludge because it's more accurate. But so as not to confuse things, we're calling them biosolids because that's what DEP is calling them and their proposed changes to the permits. Next slide, please. Biosolids is sewage sludge, and it's sewage sludge that's processed to state standards, but it still has contaminants in it. It can be applied on land, much of it is farmland, with a permit that's given out for 5 years at a time. It's primarily produced by sewage treatment facilities, and it's considered what they call a beneficial use by agency rules. That means they don't have to test whether or not it's beneficial. They've already blessed it and said that it's beneficial. It's applied on farms, in forests, and also in mine reclamation in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania produces approximately 2.2 million tons of wastewater solids every year, and about 40% of municipal utilities and other sewage facilities contract with commercial haulers to get rid of it. About half of that is applied to land, and the other half goes to landfills or is incinerated in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, it's important to note, is a net importer of sewage sludge. We take in sewage sludge from New York and New Jersey and Delaware and Maryland. So we have more sewage sludge that is applied on the land than we actually produce here within the state. What is the safest approach to biosolids application on land? Well, Delaware Riverkeeper Network and many other organizations and individuals believe that it should just be banned. But that's not what DEP is proposing. All requirements for pathogens and other pollution controls that are already in the DEP regulations and permits are not changing. They all stay in. Next slide, please. So I want to show you a map that DEP provides, and you can go on the link that's at the bottom there, and Jairus is putting it in the chat. And these are all the general permits that are given out for the application of biosolids on land. And as you can see, they're sort of clustered in the south and central portion of Pennsylvania, but they really are spread out geographically across all of the Commonwealth. Every place that these dots represent is a place where a general permit or an individual permit has been issued. So you can actually go on that link and go to that interactive map and click on it, and you can find out whether or not there's a general permit in your community for the application of biosolids. Next slide, please. Let's look at the current DEP regulations on biosolids for a minute, just so we understand the context. The current regs are at that link there. It'll be put into the chat. So as I said, there's 3 general permits. Class A biosolids are the highest quality. There's very few restrictions of what they can or cannot do with Class A biosolids. Class B is generated by sewage plants as well, and it's of a lower quality. It doesn't have to be treated to as high standards. And then number 9 is septage, and that is generated by septic systems or porta potties, and covers that application on land. There's some pathogen reduction that's required currently in the regulations. There are limits on certain pollutants, and there is requirement for reduction of vectors. Vectors are things like flies, rodents, and that's required in order to meet your class definition. Land application is mostly the way they use Class B. So most places, if you see a general permit or even an individual permit, it's probably Class B, the lower quality biosolids that's being put on the land. It's a big industry in Pennsylvania, and the big companies are Synagro, Denali, Birch Hydro, and there's a lot of money involved. Next slide, please. Let's take a look at DEP's proposed changes to the general permits. Now, as I said, there's 3 permits and 4 areas. So we're going to go through them one by one. Let's look first at the Class A or the PAG 7 biosolids permit. So these are the changes. The first area of the 4 areas are for PFAS or forever chemicals. So monitoring for PFOA and PFOS, 2 forever chemicals, will be required. There's none of that required now. When it's tested, the results will designate what tier the biosolids get classified in, and I'll explain that tiered approach right now. So regarding PFOA and PFOS, and we'll be talking more about what those are later in the webinar, but Tier 1 is if your results of the testing of the biosolids show that you have less than 20 parts per billion. Now they have UG/kg, but let's call it parts per billion because it's a little easier for most people to understand. So if it's less than 20 parts per billion for PFOA and for PFOS, then there's no land application restrictions. You can go ahead and put it on the land. Under Tier 2, there's 2 different ways to approach it. First, if your PFOA is greater than or equal to 20 and your PFOS is under 50, or if your PFOA is under 50 and your PFOS is greater than 20 but under 50, then you're in Tier 2, and you have to reduce your maximum application rate to 3 tons per acre, 3 dry tons per acre. Then for Tier 3, there's also two ways to look at it. First, if your PFOA is greater than 50, but it's less than 100 parts per billion, and if your PFOS is less than 100 parts per billion, or if your PFOA is under 100 and your PFOS is greater than 50 but under 100, then you're in Tier 3. And in that instance, you have to reduce your maximum application rate to 1.5 dry tons per acre. Tier 4. Now this is the last tier. If your PFOA is greater than or equal to 100 parts per billion, or if your PFOS is greater than or equal to 100 parts per billion, then land application is prohibited. So basically, to make it short, if you're over 100 parts per billion, land application of the biosolids is banned, is prohibited. If your testing shows that your biosolids are under 20 parts per billion for PFOA and PFOS, then you can go ahead and put it down. And then there's 2 tiers in between that have some restrictions and conditions applied to them. So there's a few other requirements attached to the PFAS changes. One of them is all except for tier 1, which is no restrictions, require the implementation of what's called a source reduction plan. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. And all but tier 4 require landowner notification. A notice of intent is required. That's the application that they put into for a general permit to DEP. And then there's some restrictions about where these biosolids cannot be applied. Now this is class A, remember. In exceptional value watersheds, it's prohibited. Now, exceptional value watersheds are a classification under Pennsylvania's Special Protection Waters Program. It's the highest quality waters in the state. Secondly, if you're getting an individual permit, then you cannot get a general permit and use that for the application of biosolids. Thirdly, you cannot put the biosolids where listed endangered or threatened species or its critical habitat might be adversely affected. And then lastly, when your biosolids are mixed with unauthorized residual waste, or when offsite deposition of the air pollutant particulate matter would result, then you cannot apply the biosolids. Next slide, please. So moving to what those 2 different conditions were on PFAS. The first one is the source reduction plan. For that, the applicant has to identify all industrial, commercial, and residential sources of PFAS. They also have to develop and implement a plan to reduce and eliminate the sources of PFAS contributing to the wastewater. And they have to monitor and report PFAS samples after the source reduction plan has been put in place to DEP. And they have to use DEP's biosolids sampling manual, and they cannot apply any biosolids until DEP signs off on that. And then there's sampling frequency and record keeping requirements for the PFAS. First of all, it depends on the volume of the biosolids. It's either 2 or 4 times a year. There's self-monitoring by the wastewater treatment facility that produces the biosolids. They have to use DEP protocol, and the reporting is done annually. That's once a year. The DEP is receives this submission from the treatment facility that prepares the biosolids on DEP's form, and the landowner is notified of the type of tier that they're classified in as a result of that. If for any reason they're not in compliance with the PFOA or PFOS limits, they have to notify DEP as soon as they find out. And there is a 5-year file retention for all of the data they're required to collect. Next slide, please. So let's look at the proposed changes to the Class A permit for the 2 other areas, and then there's one more after this. So for phosphorus. Phosphorus, or P, is a critical pollutant in sewage sludge and biosolids. There is a total maximum daily load that was put together for the Chesapeake Bay that applies to the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania in 2010. It was because the waterway and the bay were overloaded with phosphorus, primarily from the application on land of animal waste. So they developed that, and that's really the driver for why they've decided to put forward this additional restriction on biosolids for these general permits. If a receiving watershed is agriculturally impaired, as defined by DEP, the use of the P index, and that's an index that's explained at that link there. It's a link, it's a program that has been developed by the Penn State Extension, and you can get into it by going to that link. If the P index is required, it would be because 2 of the 3 following criteria apply. If the runoff goes to a special protection waterway, again, that's under the Special Protection Waters Program of DEP. If there's a substantial change in farm management, or if soil tests at or above 200 parts per million for phosphorus. So if those criteria are met, two of those three, then they have to use the P index, and they are imposed with a 150-foot setback from all surface waters. So the next area of the permit that's being looked at is storage and staging. So storage of biosolids on the farm site or the land site where it's going to be put down can cause runoff, and it can also leach pollutants into groundwater. So that this is a pathway of pollution that needs to be controlled. Storage pads with containment, such as a lip around a storage pad, or a water repellent cover, such as a tarp, is required if it's stored over 180 days. They can keep these solids stored on site, these biosolids, for a year, and they can even get a waiver of that from DEP and keep them longer. But if they do, and it's going to be over 180 days, they have to have those two things in place. You have to minimize the solids concentration to 20%, which means that they want to make sure it's not too much of a slurry. Also, the storage height and the shape of where they store it is limited. There's certain parameters they have to meet unless they keep it covered, and then they don't have any. They are supposed to minimize run-on, which is precipitation that would run into the area where the stored biosolids are, and direct runoff from the stored area. And you have to control that in order to avoid what they call discharge to waterways. And that means any type of waterway in Pennsylvania. And they can do that through best management practices, such as the use of a vegetated buffer to absorb those waters. Then they have setback distances that are required for the stored biosolids. So they cannot store biosolids within 100 feet of a perennial stream, a lake, a sinkhole, or ponds, unless there's a vegetated buffer of at least 35 feet wide used to prevent runoff. But it can't be any less than 100 feet. Also, it cannot be put within 100 feet of active private drinking water well or a spring, or in water concentration flow areas such as a ditch or ravine that might carry precipitation. And it can't be on slopes greater than 8%, and it can't be further than 100 feet from the top of the slope. Now, they're also required to control odors and dust emissions from the storage areas, because that can be quite a problem. Anybody on this webinar has them nearby, you know that. And they also have to employ Pennsylvania and EPA best management practices for any kind of earth disturbance they have to do in order to set up the infrastructure that they need to meet these storage requirements. Class A biosolids can be stored no longer than 1 year when blending, unless they get a special dispensation. But that is really, the blending is applying to Class A solids that are sold, for instance, in bags for sale. As I mentioned, sometimes they're sold at garden centers. Pellets are made to sell them for fuel. So they can't store them longer than 1 year when they're blending. And then finally, they can't store an amount that's more than what they're going to be using the next growing season on that site. And as far as staging is concerned, staging is setting up to get ready to actually put the biosolids on the land. You can't have any more than you're going to need for application on the site at the time, and you can't exceed holding it for more than 7 days. Like, might rain a couple days or whatever, but you can't keep it for longer than 7 days. Next slide, please. Pennsylvania's changes to the EQ permit to continue here. This is the last area that DEP is proposing changes to in these permits. And it's called the processing of non-captive sewage sludge, biosolids, and food waste. Well, that's bureaucratese for the blending of food waste into the sewage treatment facility processes. Food waste includes slaughterhouse waste and sewage sludge and biosolids that are not generated at that particular sewage plant site. Some sewage treatment plants want to add food waste to their anaerobic digestion process, according to Pennsylvania DEP. And DEP says the purpose of putting this into these changes into this permit is to facilitate waste to energy. That is to produce methane for use on the site and sale to natural gas companies. We'll be talking about what's wrong with this picture in a minute. Pennsylvania DEP does have some conditions on this. There's similar storage requirements for the ones that are for on-site biosolids storage. They have to limit storage time to 1 week, and they can only store what's to be used and no other type of waste except for what they're going to be using. They have to screen all incoming waste. They have to depackage it, and they have to test the food waste to show that a representative sample shows that it meets the requirements of DEP in terms of what pollutants can actually be left in those biosolids. Next slide, please. So let's look at the next permit. And I apologize here for these text-heavy slides. There's a lot of material, and hopefully we'll be able to get through this, but I know it's a lot, and I usually can't stand to have this much text on a slide, so I apologize. But let's just carry on and look at the next Class B, or the PAG 08 general permit. So this covers the use of non-exceptional biosolids. It includes mixtures of biosolids and pre- and post-consumer food waste from commercial establishments, institutions, industrial food manufacturing facilities. Also, it includes the mixtures of biosolids generated at a treatment plant site with imported biosolids from another site. So the PFOA and PFOS monitoring and the tiered approach and the limits attached to that are the same as they are in the PAG 07. The phosphorus controls, we already went through them, they're the same as the 07 permit, and so is the storage and staging requirements the same. The notice of intent is also required, and they're the same. Class B biosolids cannot be applied, and this is similar to PAG 07, but I want to make sure you all got it. First, it can't be applied in exceptional value watersheds as defined by Chapter 93 Special Protection Watershed Program. A general permit can't be used when an individual permit is required. That instance would be where you might have a stormwater basin, so a national pollution discharge elimination system permit would be needed, and you would have to get an individual permit for that. You couldn't use a general permit. Third, you can't be applied where listed endangered or threatened species or critical habitat for those species would be adversely affected. It can't be applied when off-site deposition of the air pollutant particulate matter would result. And it cannot be mixed with unauthorized residual waste. Next slide, please. So let's look at the last permit that they're proposing changes to, and that's PAG 09. This permit covers the use of non-exceptional biosolids, and it's septage. And septage is sludge from septic systems and portable toilets. It's not treated. So it covers the land application of this residential septage, and companies go around and they collect it from septic tanks at homes or from porta potty businesses, and then they apply it on land. The only proposed changes are administrative and to the general formatting requirements. All the other requirements in 07 and 08 are not being applied to the septage PAG 09. Why aren't there any substantive changes? After all, this is sludge from human sewage. Well, Pennsylvania DEP says they monitored and found little or no PFAS in this septage from sewage tanks and porta potties. They said that septic tanks don't yield phosphorus, that the sewage treatment methods used at treatment plants increase phosphorus, and they did not find significant levels of phosphorus in this septage. There is no storage or staging that is allowed for the application of septage. It's only a direct application. The truck comes in and goes out. They can't store it. So the storage and staging doesn't apply. And no food waste is allowed to be mixed in with it, or any kind of blending or processing. You can only use that septage as it came out of the tank or out of the porta potty. And they do have a notice of intent application, just like the other permits. Okay, next slide. So let's just take a breath here, with a few pictures to remind ourselves, in the big picture here, what is this all about? Well, we're talking about farms. We're talking about protecting our Pennsylvania farms from pollution. After all, these farms produce food and they produce dairy products and people eat them, but also they're part of our important environment here in Pennsylvania. And then we're talking about water quality. We're talking about water quality in streams and groundwater and potentially in drinking water sources. And that affects humans as well as non-humans, all sorts of living beings. And we're talking about very highly toxic chemicals that can have tremendous effects on all human beings and animals, but particularly on our most vulnerable populations. That's why we have a picture of a baby here, because infants and young children are the most susceptible to the impacts of PFAS, and that's been found by hundreds of studies. And we have the picture of the cow here because PFAS has been particularly damaging to farms in Maine and other places. Whole herds have had to be destroyed because of PFAS contamination because biosolids were put on their pasture. Next slide, please. Pennsylvania can do better. That's the bottom line here. Delaware Riverkeeper Network has suggested improvements to the proposed general permit provisions. And we're going to go through them here, and then we'll go into Q&A. But I do want to look at them one by one. As far as PFAS is concerned, so per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, that's PFAS or forever chemicals, are highly toxic. They're widely dispersed throughout the environment. They're even found on the North Pole in polar bears. They're persistent in the environment. They don't go away. They don't biodegrade. That is, they don't naturally break down, and they accumulate in your body. So they accumulate in your blood. Serious human health and environmental impacts, even in tiny amounts, result. And the diseases that are linked to PFAS exposure are cancers, thyroid disease, immune suppression, high cholesterol, developmental harms to fetus and children, and more. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute. So biosolids contain PFAS. Pennsylvania DEP has substantiated that. They said that's why they're making these changes and requiring limits on it. They're also a substantial pollution pathway, and that's been substantiated not only by DEP, but also by EPA a couple of decades ago, actually. So PFAS can enter soil and crops, livestock and animal products such as dairy products. It can be released into the air and dispersed to nearby lands or surface waters. It can migrate into groundwater or run off into surface water, and that means it can impact our drinking water. And the results of that is exposure to people and animals. And that exposure increases the risk of an individual developing a disease that's linked to PFAS. So it's very serious. We have some recommendations, and you can choose amongst this, and we're going to be having an action alert with a sample letter and some suggested points that you can make that we'll be sending out to you tomorrow with the recording of this webinar. And you can have choices of what you want to say, and we're going to go through some of those choices here. One is you can say, well, and I think DEP should ban the application of biosolids containing any PFAS on any land. And I think that DEP or DEP should ban the land application of biosolids at levels most PFAS labs test for. This would be a more practical thing because you can't test for amounts under 0.001 to 1 parts per billion in solids such as soil for PFOA and PFOS. And then you could also say, or say instead, that we want DEP to ban the land application of biosolids equal to or greater than 1 parts per billion for PFOA and or PFOS. Now, this is supported by the US EPA's draft sewage sludge risk assessment from 2025. So it has a lot of heft, a lot of weight, and a lot of technical backing that underpins these findings by DEP that if you go over that amount, you are going to be harming the health of people. Also, we recommend that people should tell DEP to reject the tiered approach. It's not sufficiently protective. There's no reason to have all of those tiers. Just don't allow it, or don't allow it below a certain level. And then finally, more frequent sampling and reporting is needed. Real-time public disclosure on the DEP's web system of the data is a no-brainer at this point in this electronic age. We shouldn't be waiting a year for data to come in to DEP and then have to go through a right to know in order to get it. All of this should be publicly disclosed so everybody knows what is the PFAS and the biosolids going on all over the Commonwealth. And we have links here, and we will be sending them out with a thank you email for everybody who registered for this, with a recording of the webinar and our action alert. And those different links will be references that you can refer to if you'd like, or read the documents if you'd like, that underpin why we're recommending these different changes. Next slide, please. So we're continuing this and looking now at phosphorus. And it is a critical nutrient for plants, but too much of it means that you get pollution. And sewage contains phosphorus, and sewage wastewater treatment increases phosphorus in the biosolids which is the sludge that's pulled out after the treatment process. And yet it is considered beneficial for plant growth. It's in plant cells. But what that also means is that phosphorus can encourage the growth of algae in a waterway if too much gets in the waterway. That causes eutrophication and algal blooms. Algae leads to low dissolved oxygen levels, and it produces algal toxins. And all of this suppresses life and can actually kill fish and aquatic life in the waterways. It also degrades the habitat conditions for benthic macroinvertebrates. Those are the little critters that live in the bottom of the waterway, and other aquatic life. The total maximum daily load for the Chesapeake Bay illustrates the difficulties of phosphorus management. I mentioned that it was 2010 when they put that TMDL in place, and everybody was supposed to be reducing their phosphorus inputs into the Chesapeake watershed in order to improve the waterway, and they still have problems. So it's a very difficult nutrient pollutant, and we need to deal with it aggressively in our state. Our recommendations. We support the use of the P-index to reduce phosphorus runoff for all general permits in all situations. We think it should also be used in all watersheds, not only agriculturally impaired watersheds. It is much better to prevent harm to a waterway than to try to fix it up afterwards. As a matter of fact, it's almost impossible to get it back to a good condition once it's been degraded. So it's very important for us to make sure that we prevent degradation of Pennsylvania's waters by preventing phosphorus enrichment in all of our waterways. We think, and we would recommend that you tell DEP that they require greater setbacks from water and water supply sources if they're using the P-index, because we know the water has phosphorus in it. Why wouldn't you? And you also, this is rather technical, but the DEP should account for wastewater treatment plant phosphorus removal treatment processes, and also the PO bioavailability and the biosolids and the soil fertility when they do the P-index. That's rather technical, but it's important. I wanted to bring it up for some folks who might know what that means. Next slide, please. So we also have suggested improvements to the storage, and that is the third area that is recommended by DEP for changes. So, when sitting on a site, biosolids can cause odors. They can attract flies and rodents. And wet weather can cause polluted runoff and it can also cause leaching of leachate from the biosolids, concentrated pollution into our groundwater, and it can cause other pollution events. So even though DEP says that they only allow short-term storage in certain instances, it really isn't enough. Problems remain, so we need to have more restrictions. And 1 year is way too long. And we believe that it should be limited to 30 days 30 days under normal circumstances, and we'll be making recommendations in our action alert for that. And then staging prepares the material for land application, and it also has to be limited in duration more than it is. So our recommendations: wide setback distances from waterways protect water quality. There's a lot of science behind that, and states and the federal government, when it was doing good things, were making sure that we paid attention to how to protect water quality through protecting our streams. So setbacks from pollutants is very important. These are some of the things you could say. And each of these is backed up by a different source which you could cite. One is a 1,000-foot setback from exceptional value wetlands. That's the highest quality wetlands. And drinking water sources, that's the best. But it should be at least 300 feet setback from drinking water sources. And that's backed up by regulations in some states. There should be a 300-foot buffer for exceptional value and high quality streams. This is supported by science, and it is implemented by states like New Jersey. But in Pennsylvania, the separation distance, according to current regulations from EV and HQ wetlands, that buffer is and waterways, that buffer must be at least 150 feet. So there's no way they should make it any less than 150 feet. And they're not specifying that in these proposed changes. There should be 150-foot buffers for all perennial and intermittent streams. For best water quality protection, buffers should be required to be vegetated, and that is backed up by the National Resources Conservation Service science. Also, biosolids should not be applied in areas where vectors and odors can be a nuisance to adjoining land uses, such as schools or parks. Our public has invested in these, and our children go to our schools, and we need to protect them from odors and vectors. And the best way to do that is to not allow it near them. And then there should be limited storage of biosolids on a site where it's going to be distributed to 30 days. And then in certain circumstances, and we'll delve into that in our action alert, no more than 60 days. And there should always be roof covered areas for any storage. That's not being required now. They're requiring tarps in some instances. We believe it should be a maximum coverage of the entire area by a roof. Next slide, please. So the last area where they're talking about changes is the processing of non-captive sewage, sludge, biosolids, and food waste. That's a big mouthful again. And that's the blending of food waste, which includes slaughterhouse waste, even blood, and imported sewage sludge into the sewage plant's anaerobic digester. And that generates methane that can be used for energy for use on site and sale to natural gas companies. Now, we already have methane being flared off from sewage treatment plants. Why would we want more? Well, Pennsylvania DEP says its purpose is to facilitate waste to energy. Our recommendation: abandon any consideration of this proposal. It's ridiculous. These general permits are asserted for beneficial use for agriculture, benefiting growing of crops and livestock and farm products, and enrichment of soil as per the US EPA. It's wrong to assume that generating energy is one of the benefits of the land application of biosolids. It doesn't compute. Waste to energy is not an agricultural pursuit. It shouldn't belong here at all. No research or data is provided by DEP proving the effectiveness, the efficiency, or the safety of intentionally producing more methane through commingled food waste. And I just want to make sure everybody remembers Methane is flammable, explosive, displaces oxygen and can actually asphyxiate people if you're close to it when it's released, and it's dangerous to human health in many ways. It's a highly potent greenhouse gas. It exacerbates climate change. And as a matter of fact, methane is 85% more powerful than carbon in warming the atmosphere on a 20-year time frame. We don't need more of it. As a matter of fact, we need to be reducing it in order to meet climate change goals. Methane is a very small molecule. It leaks profusely. It's notorious that regardless of the attempts at control, you just can't keep it from leaking out. Next slide, please. So there's just a few notes here. Again, this is text heavy. I apologize, but I want to make sure we have this. We're thinking about this as we think about these permits. Scientific studies show serious adverse health effects from biosolids. That includes PFAS and other contaminants that are in biosolids. For instance, there is a higher incidence of health harms to people living on or within 1 mile of fields where biosolids were applied. And that link there takes you to the study that examines that and proves it. Eating edible products from fields with biosolids containing PFAS can have negative health effects. That report proves that. PFAS and other pollutants in biosolids can contaminate drinking water, groundwater, and surface water. Look at that link in order to see the underpinnings of that. And it can be distributed by air from dust and soil volatilization. And there's a report on that as well. Bottom line, biosolids and sewage sludge are a pollution problem. And they're really a waste issue. They shouldn't be applied on land. We shouldn't be turning our land into a waste facility. None of the following that I'm going to mention is being proposed for changes, but you might want to mention it in any comments that you make. Number one, biosolids regulations. Not only the general permits should be overhauled to reflect robust, independent science and health findings. I think it's been a couple decades since they did that. And any kind of regulation or general permit changes should employ the findings and the citations in EPA's draft risk assessment for biosolids from 2025, because as you'll see, if you look at that, there are pages and pages of scientific articles backing up everything that they recommend, which is that PFAS not be applied to land if it exceeds 1 part per billion for PFOA and PFOS. And then sewage sludge processed into biosolids is not going to be banned according to these proposed changes, but land application really should be stopped. And you can say that. There's nothing that's going to keep you from saying that. Put that right into your comment and let DEP know what you're thinking, if that's what you're thinking. Biosolids containing PFOA and PFOS, bottom line, they can still apply those on land. So we're still going to have them entering into our environment from biosolids being put down on land. They should prohibit it. So there's only 2 PFAS that are proposed for limits, that's PFOA and PFOS. Those are the most commonly found, but there are many thousands of PFAS compounds. And there's a report that we're referencing here where EPA has toxicological profiles and has developed ways to test for and verify 12 types of PFAS that are known because they've found them in sewage sludge. Biosolids can contain thousands of contaminants. And I'm really cramming this in here, but I think we should understand, even if there weren't a PFAS problem, some of these contaminants are highly toxic. They're treated to a standard that DEP considers safe, but they don't have to completely eliminate them. Some of it may still go in, even in Class A biosolids, even when you might buy it as fertilizer in a bag in a store. And some of those, just so you get an idea, and you can delve into the permits if you want to, and the regulations if you want to see full lists. But some of those contaminants are metals, such as arsenic and mercury and lead, pharmaceuticals, radioactive materials, a real problem in sludge, microplastics and nanoplastics, excess nutrients, such as phosphorus and nitrogen that we talked about, bacteria, such as fecal coliform, salmonella, staphylococcus, pathogenic microorganisms such as protozoa, and parasites such as uh, cyclospora, which is making everybody, been reading about it in the press, making everybody so sick now from the lettuce. It can be in biosolids, and they only have to reduce it to a certain amount. Enteric viruses such as norovirus, hepatitis A, and also helminth ova, which are the eggs for large parasitic worms. Next slide, please. So at this time, we're going to open it up. I've been talking a long time. Uh, and we're going to try to take some questions and answers from people, and Jairus has been collecting them. So Jairus, why don't you go ahead?
Sure thing. Thanks, Tracy. We have a couple questions. So, first one is, do they specify a certain type of water repellent cover that must be used for biosolid storage? Asking because so many of those can contain PFAS, potentially introducing yet another PFAS runoff source.
That's a very good point. Um, plastic does Many plastics, especially durable plastics, um, contain PFAS or break down into PFAS, but no, they don't. They say examples could be a tarp, but no, there's no specification for what type of tarp or what type of impervious covering they're supposed to use. That's why we said there should be a roof. Um, and not just a tarp. Tarp also doesn't work very well because it can develop pockets and water can then collect in it and be a breeding spot for mosquitoes.
And then the next question was, if a wastewater treatment plant has a general permit, would that preclude them from ever obtaining an individual permit?
No, if they have a general permit, they can what happens is this: the municipal authority, for instance, goes and gets a permit, applies, files an NOI with DEP, which is the application. They get their permit, and then they can apply it on lands, and it could be various lands. It could be 2 or 3 different farms using that general permit. But some instances are individual permits required, such as the one that I mentioned, which would be one that might have a stormwater basin. And if there's a stormwater basin, then there's a discharge, and that requires a discharge permit, or what's called a National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit. And in that instance, they have to get an individual permit, regardless of whether or not they have a general permit. So it really depends on site-specific considerations, whether you're going to be able to use a general permit or an individual permit has to be applied for.
Great. And then the next question is, do any other states that you know of, do any of them have a program to produce methane from blending slaughterhouse waste and imported sewage sludge? Is there any evidence or indication that natural gas companies were at the table helping PADP to write this plan?
Yeah, to tell you the truth, I don't know whether other states already have done this blending of slaughterhouse waste, but I believe that natural gas companies were at the table. I think the whole concept of waste to energy is something that comes out of the energy sector. Natural gas companies are all for it because they're going to get a source for methane they can put into their pipelines, but it's very problematic. We have looked at this issue separate from these general permit changes that are being proposed by DEP. We've looked at the issue of blending landfill gas and or sewage treatment gas into the gas pipeline system. And it's very difficult to clean it to the standards that are required under the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Administration. And DEP knows that. And I think and another problem is that DEP is trying to get rid of its slaughterhouse waste in a way that's not as obvious. To me, it's pretty outrageous that you're going to be able to put slaughterhouse waste, and this is, ground up animals and pieces of animals and blood, not to be too graphic, but that's what it really is, as well as, vegetables and dairy products and everything all mixed up. But that food waste that's blended in there, you can get a permit separately outside of these general permits to apply on land. Slaughterhouse waste has a whole separate permitting system. And it is problematic because where that slaughterhouse waste is applied, people suffer. And they're there are places in Pennsylvania right now that are screaming about it. And, particularly right now, you look at the summer, and when this slaughterhouse waste is being applied, because they can't apply it when the ground is frozen and under certain conditions, and it's hot, it's smelly, it's the breeding ground for vermin. So their DEP is trying to kill two birds with one stone, make the natural gas companies happy because they're going to get methane, and maybe for free, not have to drill for it. And it's also helping them get rid of some of the slaughterhouse waste that's so nasty that nobody wants to put on land near where they live.
And then next question, any science that would indicate the setback should be 1,000 feet from the adjoining property lines as opposed to 300 feet from occupied dwellings, which is the current requirement?
The current requirement of 300 feet can be reduced down. I think I mentioned that, but it can be reduced down to as little as 100 feet if the landowner gives okay for that. But I've looked through some of the other states. I didn't see any that was as large as 1,000. But if anyone does know of another state that, or another, uh, area area of regulation that justifies 1,000, I think that we would definitely want to have the strictest regulations possible in order to be able to protect adjoining property owners, waterways, uses of land such as parks. So if we could go to 1,000, that'd be great. If anybody wants to share any kind of citations for that, that would be great.
And Tracy, let me know. I have about two more questions. Is that fine?
Yeah, let's go with one and then we'll see how far we get.
Sure. So the next question is, what kind of enforcement or inspection system is there currently to enforce permits? Would township managers, for example, have the authority to check on things and maintain compliance?
As far as I know, township managers do not have that authority. Now, maybe a township could pass an ordinance to give some authority to a township staff, but these are enforced by DEP, but also the management plans have to be filed with the conservation district. And the conservation district is the one that is supposed to make sure that they stick to their management plans, like where they're applying the biosolids, how much they're applying, and the various requirements they have and how they actually apply the solids to the property. So that's another way that these permits or the applications, not the permits, but the application of the land is looked over by a different agency, the conservation districts. But DEP, they're short-staffed. I think they really want to make changes, and these changes that they're recommending are better than what we have. Like they don't even monitor for PFAS now, for instance. So there's definite improvements. They just need to go a lot further, and perhaps they really want to, but they need to have public support to do that. So that's why we think that we should comment. We should say we want them to do better. We want them to make changes. We don't want them to stay the same because we have practically zero protection under the current regulations and general permits. And then you add into that the lack of adequate staff at DEP to stay on top of all this, the fact that they only have to file, yearly reports and all of that, just the lack of monitoring, the very minimal amount of oversight for these permits is really exposing the public, and it's not protective and in the way that the Pennsylvania needs to be protected. I think now we need to go to our closing slides, and we'll try to answer if there's an extra question. We'll try to answer that by email. What we want to do is look at the actions that we need to take, and we really need to step up and take action. Even if you just only have a few minutes, we have a way that you can do that. We need comments to DEP on these proposed changes. So, like I said, despite the fact that these revisions are not being comprehensive and they're only applying to the general permits, not to the regulations. It's really important that we comment to improve what's currently in place, which is wholly inadequate. It's not protective of human health. It's not protective of animals or wildlife or the environment. And people and animals and ecosystems are being exposed today and they're suffering as a result. And the dangers of biosolids being applied on land need to be addressed. So we have to do something. We can't let the status quo stay in place. We need to comment. We need to see changes. We just need to go further. So DRN is recommending many comments be submitted to do what we can to protect folks and to eliminate the harms that people, wildlife, farm animals, and the environment is experiencing. We recommend that DEP hold a public hearing. And this is the first comment that we're going to make, suggestion that we're going to make on every comment that's filed. It's not enough to only have written comments. A lot of people just don't have the time to sit down and write stuff. And yet they might run over to a hearing if it's in a convenient location near where they live. So we think we need public hearings. They should be located around Pennsylvania where there are permits, and people should have the opportunity to just come out and stand up and have their few minutes to say their piece. So we need to expand the public permit input into this permit process. Believe me, the industry is powerful on this. And the sewage sludge and biosolids industry is in there talking to DEP. We need to be speaking to them too. You can submit more than one comment if you wish. You can do one. You can do more on one day. You can do it on different days whenever you get a minute. Please share this call for comments when we send out the action alert. Delaware Riverkeeper Network is going to be sharing these points. We're going to be providing the citations that we discussed and others that you can refer to in order to back up what you're saying. But the most important thing is for you to tell DEP your concerns. And if you're experiencing any effects of the application of biosolids, tell them about your experience because you're the expert on that, not them. And tell them how you think biosolids and sewage sludge problems can be addressed. That's really important. We think that we should be doing more composting, separation of waste, and making sure that our sewage treatment plants are not overloaded by PFAS by reducing the sources of PFAS into the human and the built environment. So, lastly, how to comment. Now, this is from the Pennsylvania DEP bulletin. And, frankly, it's a little complex, but they say that you have to reference in the subject line that you're commenting on these particular permits. And we didn't write it all because it's too much for this slide, but there's a permit number for each of these, 7, 8, and 9. You have to mention that permit number, and you'll be getting that in the follow-up email. And you say, and you have to file that by, 1 minute before midnight on Wednesday, September 2nd. And if you want to go and look at the general permits themselves, we're providing those links. So to do this, you can use DEP's online e-comment system, and they have a platform that you go in, and then they have a template, and you put your comment into it. That's one way you can do it. And you would write it yourself in that instance, or you might want to look at something we send and copy and paste or something, but however you want to use that. But you can also send an email, and that is actually very convenient. It goes to DEP, or you can send it in writing, and we put the office address here. You can do that as well. Send it, an old-fashioned handwritten letter or a typewritten letter if you want. But the comments have to include, even those that are sent by email, your name and address. You can't leave that off. You can't put an anonymous comment in. So let's stand up. Let's tell DEP what we want. We want changes. We support them trying to make changes, but we want them to do more. Last slide, please. So it's 1 minute after 8. We pretty much kept to our promise to honor your time and finish in an hour, but I want to make sure that you have our resources here. We have a link that goes to on our webpage For PFAS in there, we have information about biosolids. And also you could become a DRN e-activist if you're not already an e-activist. And you do that by signing up right there. And then you automatically get notices when there's an opportunity for a comment like this. And then if you have specific questions, feel free to reach out to me. That's my email address. Jairus put all of these into the chat. So I want to thank everybody again. We really appreciate giving us some of your precious time tonight to look at this super important issue. And we hope that you will think about making comment to DEP so we can improve what they're proposing in terms of changes to the permits. Thank you very much, everybody.